Now, just quickly, I want us to look at two things. We haven't much time, but I want to talk about the cross for just a second. Let me give you something, and you just ponder it in your mind. What do you think about it? That when Jesus was hanging on the cross, God the Father looked down from heaven and saw the punishment that was heaped upon Him by the hands of men, and God counted that as payment for our sin. Do you know what that is? That's heresy. That's false doctrine. Our sins were not paid for. Our sins were not put away because of what the Romans did to Jesus. Our sins were put away because of what God did to Jesus. Remember when He was on the cross and He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" What you need to understand, I've heard preachers say that God looked down at His Son and couldn't bear to see His suffering, so He turned away. Are you telling me God lacked the moral fortitude to see His Son suffer? That's not what Jesus said. Jesus said the Father had forsook Him, abandoned Him. What does that mean? Well, you know those tracts of ours where it says man is sinful and God is holy, therefore there's a great separation between the two? In order to close that separation, my friend, someone had to die separated from the favorable presence of God, to suffer outside the gates of the city, cut off from God, cut off from man. You and I deserve eternal punishment outside of the favorable presence of God. In order to pay for that, in order to satisfy that, Christ had to suffer our abandonment. In Psalms 22, we have that very verse, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The psalmist cries it out. And he even argues, all throughout the history of your covenant people Israel, no righteous man has ever cried out to you that you have not answered, but I cry to you day and night and you do not answer me. Why? And then he gives the answer. Because you are the Holy One and I am a worm. Christ became that worm. He became that serpent lifted up in the wilderness. He became the one who bore our sins, and He was cut off from God. And not only cut off from God, but crushed under the wrath of God. Have you never read in Isaiah 53:10? It pleased the Lord, Yahweh, to crush Him. It pleased God to crush the Messiah, His own Son. Does that mean that God got some gleeful satisfaction or joy out of crushing His Son? Absolutely not. What it means is that God's will was prospered. It was carried out. Salvation was made available to men because on that tree, Jesus Christ bore their sins, and the wrath of God that should be poured out on wicked men was poured out on the head of His own Son, and Christ was crushed on that tree. I'll give you an example. And this is, I always love to say this because it turns so many errors away from us. When Christ is in the garden and He cries out so many times, 3 times, "Let this cup pass from me. Let this cup pass from me. Let this cup pass from me." I've heard preachers say that Christ could foresee the Roman cross and the nails and the crown of thorns and the whip upon His back and all the shame and all the part of what it meant, a Roman crucifixion. My friend, that's absolutely absurd. I'll prove it. After the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the ascension into heaven, for the next 3 centuries, Christians, almost without number, were crucified. It was what you did to Christians. Not only were they crucified upside down. Not only were they crucified upside down, they were covered with pitch or tar or kerosene, and they were lit on fire to provide lights for the city of Rome. And the testimony of history is that most of them went to those crosses singing hymns joyfully, counting it a privilege to die for their master. Now, are you going to tell me that the followers of Jesus Christ boldly go to a cross singing hymns with joy while the captain of their salvation hides in a garden? Do you really think he feared a Roman cross? What was in the cup? The wrath of God was in the cup. That he would have, the one who is holy, would have to bear our sin. You don't think that's that big of a deal, and I'll tell you why. We can no more understand the dreadfulness of sin than a fish can understand that it's wet. A fish is always wet. We were born in sin, surrounded by it. In Job, we understand we drink down sin like it was water. It doesn't bother us, and each generation becomes harder. Do you realize that? More calloused to it. But Christ was the holy, holy, holy Son of God, who knew nothing but his Father's favor throughout all of eternity. But on that tree, he bore our filth. And he suffered abandonment